Throughout the long history of the Roman civilization, the people of Rome had developed some of the strangest methods of executions ever. This video is going to look at 7 of the most brutal, painful, and strange executions of that era. The Tarpeian Rock. This process would begin with a long walk up to the Capitoline Hill, specifically to the jagged cliff known as the Tarpeian Rock. The condemned victim, who would typically be a traitor or a perjurer, would be led to the edge of the cliff in front of a public crowd. They would then be stripped of their status to symbolize their exclusion from society, then blindfolded. Guards or officials ensured the person could not resist or step away, keeping them positioned at the brink. The actual execution was performed by the tribunes, who would physically hurl the victim off the cliff. The 80-foot drop onto the jagged rocks below was intended to be immediately fatal, or at least to cause catastrophic internal injuries. In many cases, the impact resulted in broken bones, severe trauma, and rapid death. Because the rock overlooked the Forum, the body remained visible at the heart of Rome's political center for some time after the fall. This would serve as a warning to anybody about the consequences of betraying the Roman Empire. Execution by elephant. While rare in the city of Rome itself, this execution method is certainly one of the more brutal ones on this list. It was primarily used against deserters or rebels in the provinces. The condemned was usually bound to a stake or forced to lie on the ground in a public square or military camp, ensuring they could not move or escape. The setting was arranged so that witnesses, either soldiers or civilians, could clearly observe what happened. A trained war elephant, guided by its mahout rider, would then be brought forward. At a signal, the elephant was directed towards the victim. In some cases, it would be commanded to crush the legs or pelvis first in order to prolong the death, before eventually crushing the victim's skull with a single foot. In other cases, they would use the trunk to lift and throw the person before trampling them. The method depended on the handler's instructions and the training of the animal. Usually, one step from the elephant's foot would be enough to destroy any vital organ in the body. This method was definitely one of the more brutal and barbaric ones used by the Romans. Forced suicide. For members of the Roman elite, the order to commit suicide allowed the act to take place in private rather than through a public execution. The most common process was by cutting open the veins. The individual would withdraw to a private room, often accompanied by trusted companions or a physician who could supervise the process. Using a sharp blade, they would cut major veins, commonly at the wrists, though sometimes at the ankles or behind the knees. To maintain blood flow and prevent clotting, the person often entered a warm bath. As blood loss continued, the body weakened, which would lead to dizziness and eventual unconsciousness. Death followed once enough blood had been lost. If the process slowed, additional cuts or other measures might be used to ensure it continued to completion. What made this death so disturbing was that you had to cut the veins open yourself, all the while some of the closest people to you watched, completely unable to help you. Crucifixion. Crucifixion is a much more known execution method, but it doesn't take away from how painful it could be. The process was designed to prolong suffering and make death take as long as possible. It began with scourging, where the condemned was whipped with a flagrum, a whip fitted with metal or bone pieces that tore into the skin and caused heavy bleeding. This stage alone left the person severely weakened before the main execution began. The condemned was then forced to carry the patibulum, which is the crossbeam, all the way to the execution site. There, they were attached to the cross, either by ropes or nails driven through strong parts of the body such as the wrists and feet. Once suspended, the position of the body made breathing difficult. The person had to push upward to breathe, which became harder as exhaustion set in. Over time, fatigue, blood loss, and dehydration worsened the condition until the individual could no longer lift themselves, leading to death from respiratory failure. Death could take multiple hours, making it one of the more painful ones on this list. Damnatio ad bestias. Reserved for the lowest class of criminals, this execution took place during the midday interval of the games that were hosted in the Roman Colosseum. The condemned was brought into the arena, sometimes bound to a stake or placed within a staged setting designed to resemble a natural or mythological scene. There was often a delay before the animals were released, leaving the person exposed in the arena. These animals could be anything from lions and leopards to even bears. These animals would be released from underground cages using trapdoors or lifting mechanisms. Once in the arena, the animals would approach and attack quite viciously, as they were often starved before the fight. The outcome depended on the animal and the nature of the attack, but death generally followed from severe injuries inflicted during the mauling. The process ended only when the victim was no longer alive. Burning alive. In Roman law, burning was often used as punishment for crimes involving fire. One of the most well-known methods involved the tunica molesta, the uncomfortable shirt. The condemned was forced to wear a garment made of flammable materials such as cloth or papyrus, heavily treated with pitch, wax, and sulfur. They were then tied to a stake in a public area or within an arena to prevent movement. Once everything was in place, the garment was ignited. The chemicals ensured that the fire burned intensely and spread quickly across the body. The heat caused severe burns, and the person could not escape due to the restraints. Death resulted from the combined effects of burns, heat, and smoke inhalation. This was a very humiliating death, as the victims would scream for help as hundreds of onlookers would stare and ignore them. This execution method was quite drawn out and could last multiple minutes before the victim succumbed to the injuries. Punishment of the sack. The poena culae, or punishment of the sack, was used specifically for those convicted of killing a parent. The condemned was first restrained and beaten, then fitted with a covering such as a hood. After this, they were placed inside a large leather sack. Before sealing the sack, 4 live animals were also placed in the bag with them. These animals would be a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The sack was then sewn shut tightly so nothing inside could escape. It was transported by cart to a body of water, such as a river or the sea, and then thrown in. Inside the sack, the confined space and lack of air quickly became critical, while the animals could also cause injury. Death would occur by drowning once the sack submerged and filled with water. Strangulation. Strangulation in the Tullianum was a method of execution reserved for high-profile political prisoners and foreign leaders who were considered major enemies of the state. The Tullianum, also known as the Mamertine prison, was a multi-level facility located near the Roman Forum, with the execution chamber situated in a dark, subterranean dungeon accessible only through a small hole in the floor. This method was often the final step for captured leaders who had first been paraded through the city during a general's official victory parade, or triumph. The execution was performed in secret by an official who used a cord or noose to strangle the prisoner. Death occurred through asphyxiation as the airway and blood flow were restricted. Once the individual was dead, the body was removed from the dungeon and thrown onto the Gemonian stairs, a public staircase leading into the forum. This public display served as a legal and visual confirmation that the threat to Rome had been permanently eliminated, allowing the citizens to witness the body of the defeated enemy.